Good morning and thanks for joining us. My name is Steve Lamont and I serve as the chair for the South Orange County Economic Coalition, as well as CEO for the Building Industry Association of Orange County. And I'd like to welcome you to our 2020 Virtual Economic Report. The Economic Coalition serves as the business advocacy arm for the South Orange County region. And we're excited to bring you this virtual report on the state of our economy, recovery, and riding through this pandemic. We are joined today by renowned economist, Dr. Christopher Thornburg, founder of Beacon Economics, who we'll hear from in just a moment. But first, I'd like to thank our phenomenal sponsors. Our platinum sponsors, San Diego Gas and Electric and Cox Communications. Our gold sponsors, Southern California Gas Company and the toll roads. This event was made possible by your generous sponsorships, and we continue to look towards your support. Don't forget, if you have a question during Dr. Thornburg's presentation, go ahead and comment in the stream below, and we'll get those answered during our live Q&A following the presentation. We are thrilled you're joining us today for what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion on not only where the economy is today, but really where we are headed. We'll be right back with Dr. Chris Thornburg after a brief message from one of our platinum sponsors.
Hi, I'm Dwayne Cave, External Relations Manager for San Diego Gas and Electric. We hope that you and yours are doing well during these unprecedented times due to the COVID-19 virus. At SDG&E, we're working every day to provide you with safe, clean, reliable energy for your home and workplace. I'm happy to be here today as SDG&E has supported the South Orange County Economic Coalition since its inception. We are proud to be a supporter of the Economic Coalition and today's program, the annual Economic Forecast. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed today's program.
During these extraordinary times, SDG&E is here for you.
We are working 24/7 to keep the power flowing.
We're here to help if you can't pay your bill.
With bill relief through our CARE program.
We know energy is essential.
To power phones and computers.
To cook meals.
And warm baby bottles.
To keep hospitals up and running.
And stay connected.
We're all in this together.
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 Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. I'm Chris Thornburg. I'm the founding partner of Beacon Economics, and I'm down here to talk a little bit about the economy. Now, as you know, of course, things are in turmoil right now. And this really did come out of a left field, if you will, in a very proverbial sense. Let me go ahead and get going on my slides here. It's funny you should mention that. Is that not working then? Okay, anyway. It's been an interesting few weeks, to say the very least. This is a slide I did just a couple months ago at the end of one of my presentations. And it's interesting because even in February, I was talking about an ongoing, the continuation of the current economic expansion we are currently in the midst of. And really, in many ways, back then I was pushing back against a lot of the commentary that were predicting a recession. Indeed, in the start of this year, I was actually feeling a little proud of myself. I pointed out, of course, that at the end of last year, 75% of economists who contribute to the Wall Street Journal said we were going to have a recession by the end of 2021. 50% said by the end of 2020. Now, of course, what actually happened? Well, in February this year, when they redid the poll, most of those economists who contribute had actually backed off those negative predictions. And indeed, I was saying, see, told you, things are just fine. But if you look in that lower left-hand corner, even in February when I was giving this talk, we already saw the beginnings, the signs of what was really eventually to completely overwhelm our economy and in many ways completely overwhelm all the conversations about our economy. And that, of course, is what we now know as the COVID-19 or of course the coronavirus disease that is currently really ripping across the globe. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of the pandemic. I'm sure you, like I, have been absolutely flooded with conversations about the virus and what's happening across the globe. What we're really here to talk about is what does it mean for the economy of the United States, of California, right here in Orange County. How bad are things? And indeed, this is something that we are still trying to figure out. You know, we have lots of information, very rapid information, from a public health standpoint, talking about the number of people who've died, the number of people who are sick. We're constantly upping our efforts to test more and more folks while we're in the midst of this really unprecedented public health mandated economic shutdown. But we don't have a lot of data yet. Indeed, the first set of economic data just came out a few weeks ago when we got Q1 GDP. And Q1 GDP, despite the fact that the virus and the shutdowns that accompanied it were really only in the last few weeks of March, well, Q1 came in at about a negative 4.8%, which means the economy contracted by about 1.2% from the fourth quarter of last year to the first quarter of this year. So we're really at the beginning end of it. A lot of economists are trying to figure this all out. And the big question in everybody's mind is, how bad is this going to look? Well, you know, first place you have to start here is from a position of humility. You know, in a lot of ways, what's happening in our economy today is something we haven't dealt with in a very, very long time in any substantive fashion. And as such, the lessons, the models, the metaphor of past business cycles don't necessarily apply perfectly to this one. So I like to say we all have to start with an understanding that this is a different kind of shock to the economy, and we're not clear how it's going to shake out. But there's an old expression that I've always enjoyed. A good forecaster is not smarter than everybody else. He merely has his ignorance better organized. What I'm going to try to do over the next 40 minutes or so is organize my ignorance just a little bit to help both myself and you better understand what's happening and where this thing is heading. What kind of recovery can we expect once these public health mandates go away? Well, in terms of the question of how bad, you've undoubtedly been hearing, of course, the standard public opinion. And the standard of public opinion, the stuff we see in the newspapers all the time, real estate markets are going to blow up. Millions of people are going to be out of work for months, if not years. The financial markets all over the place. The OECD and the IMF are warning this will be clearly worse than the Great Recession, perhaps as bad as the Great Depression. And this kind of negativity, well, let me go ahead and give you an example of that. Here's a couple forecasts from some of the large banks out there. The left-hand side comes from Bank of America, and this came from a few weeks ago. And if you take a close look, this is a pretty dramatic negative forecast. They're talking about overall about a 10% decline in real economic output in the second quarter of this year, and of course the third quarter even being a little bit worse. And they're not talking about economic output getting back to previous levels of activity until the end of next year. By the way, this would make it substantially worse than the Great Recession. In the Great Recession, there was only about a 5.5% of reduction in overall real GDP. UBS, a similarly grim outlook for the economy. Unemployment staying in the double digits right into the middle of next year and not getting back to normal levels until the end of 2022. These are negative numbers. Now, to put this a little better in context, though, let's take a step back and remember where we started the conversation. In February of this year, I was talking about how our view of the economy, an economy that was sound, that was going to continue to expand, turned out to be right after all the negativity of 2019. But the negativity of 2019, you can't just put that to one side. We have to remember when it comes to any kind of conversations about the economy, hysteria is truly the new normal. Look, at the beginning of 2019, in January of that year, the stock markets were down by 20% over just the past couple months from the peak that it hit in November of 2018. And 75% of economists who contributed to that Wall Street Journal next recession survey said the next recession was going to be in 2020 for sure, or somewhere in 2019. And they were worried about the real estate markets collapsing, about the Chinese trade war that was going to demolish U.S. manufacturing, about the fact that interest rates and inflation were on the rise, and so on and so forth. Again, hysteria is the new normal. Every time you turn around, there's almost this competition to create the worst possible view of the economy around us. And that is the one that seems to capture the headlines. It happens over and over and over again. Miserableism is what I call it. Now, there's no doubt that the COVID virus and the corresponding public health mandated shutdowns of the economy are by far and away the largest shock to hit our economy, at least in a decade. And I will go to the next step and say that almost assuredly we are currently in a recession. But even if those two things are true, I would also argue that headline in the newspaper, the talking heads among us, have simply taken the hyperbolic hysteria and upped it proportionately. You can't buy into this stuff because a lot of people are making a lot of assumptions that really don't have basis in any kind of logical deduction. And to start with this conversation, let's first start with the idea of what a recession is in the first place. Because I think that once we understand a little bit about what that is, then maybe we'll have a little better sense of how to think about the current circumstances. Growth is the default mode of any economy because an economy is made up of millions of people trying to get ahead. They're trying to get ahead for themselves, for their families, for their businesses. They're working hard. They're out there on a day-to-day basis, slugging, pushing hard to make things happen. And when you collectively look at the results of all these people working hard to get ahead, the economy grows. But every once in a while, along the way, we know bad things happen. Now, for the most part, the shocks that happen to the system, whether it's something like a big storm or the fact that one sector is on the rise because of technological change, it may hurt another sector, whatever the case is, these small shocks are small enough to be absorbed by the rest of the economy, and they don't set that growth trend off target. But once in a while, a shock hits the system that actually can throw things into disequilibrium in the short run. A recession-causing shock to the system has to have three characteristics. It has to be very large, it has to be rapid, and most important, it has to be sustained. When this happens, enough people lose their jobs, there's enough turmoil put into supply chains that you create a feedback effect. That is to say, where the initial shock to the system causes enough reduction in aggregate demand that can't be absorbed by the rest of the economy, that more people get laid off and there's more disruption in other supply chains. And that feedback effect takes the initial shock and expands it to the point at which the economy is now no longer growing, but can shrink for a year to a year and a half, something like that. And those are the episodes we call recessions. Remember, a shock that is large, it's large, rapid, and sustained. Now, if you think about the Great Recession, since that's the most recent economic downturn, and of course, the worst downturn our nation has faced since prior to World War II, well, understand that the roots of the Great Recession really stemmed in the 6 years that preceded it. In those 6 years, the United States dealt with really what turned out to be one of the greatest financial frauds in global economic history. And of course, that was the subprime asset-backed security scandal, where, functionally speaking, Wall Street developed a way of just pumping trillions of dollars into the household sector in the U.S. economy with no underwriting. Now, that $15 trillion of credit caused parts of our economy to expand far beyond any sustainable level. Now, we all know about housing in terms of course, the enormous amount of borrowing, the incredibly frenzied market, and the huge increases in home prices we saw. But of course, there was also other forms of borrowing, whether it was subprime credit loan, credit card loans, or subprime auto loans, and so on and so forth. And remember, all that cheap credit, incredibly strong housing market, caused consumers to stop saving as much. We saw the U.S. consumer sector households begin to overspend. And we saw savings rates go to a very dangerously low place, even as the U.S. economy opened up a massive trade deficit. In 2006, while it felt good, when the economy seemed healthy, the reality was growth was built on these rotten cores, and it was only a function of time until that subprime bubble imploded, and all the jobs that were created by it were going to go away. And that's exactly what began to happen in early 2007. That's when everything started to fall apart. First the housing market and the lack of credit, and then eventually, of course, consumers had to pull back, and it's thrust us into a 6-quarter recession where the economy contracted by 5.5% in real terms, and the unemployment rate hit 10%. Now, if you think about where we are today, it's easy to understand why people are leaping to the conclusion that this is going to be worse than the Great Recession. We just got the April unemployment rate number, and it's already 14.7%. To put that in context, that's the highest it's been since the Great Depression. That is a scary high number. And just looking at that in a vacuum, you'd say, yeah, clearly this is worse than the Great Recession. But take a look closer look at this. There's something else here that's worth pointing out. You see, employment is what economists like to call a lagging indicator. That is to say, it lags everything else happening in the economy. For example, if you go back to the Great Recession, which ended in June of 2009, you'll see that the unemployment rate was actually increasing all the way through the Great Recession and actually peaked after the Great Recession was over. In other words, it was a consequence of the implosion of the subprime bubble that had happened a year and a half earlier. It always happens last. And that's because businesses, understandably, don't want to lay off their employees. They don't want to close their doors. They fight tooth and nail, they keep going, and they only give up at the last possible moment. Hence, it's a lagging indicator. This time around, that pattern is not at all being seen. Quite from being a lagging indicator, this is a leading indicator. We started this situation with, of course, millions of people simply being forced to go home because public health mandates prevented their companies from operating. And that's important. It sounds trite, but it's incredibly important. And here's another way of thinking about it. This is data that came out of that April report, which we just got released last week. And take a look on the left-hand side. That's the share of unemployed people who claim to be on temporary layoff. By the way, that's functionally everybody. If you look back, say, around the Great Recession, only 10% of the people who were unemployed during the Great Recession called themselves on temporary layoff. Those were millions of people who understood their job was not coming back. That company was not coming back. Millions of people in finance, construction, real estate, and retail, those folks had to go out and find new careers in new parts of the economies. It was a painful hit, and it took years for them to get themselves back on their feet. This time around, we don't see any of that. In fact, the number of people who were unemployed in April 2019 was 5.38 million. In April of this year, 22.5 million. That's an increase of 17.1 million. By the way, on temporary layoff, those who claim that went from 574,000 to 17.87 million. In other words, functionally speaking, the entire increase in unemployment are people who are claiming to be on temporary layoff. That's completely different. What you start to realize is you cannot look at employment trends the way you have in the past. In the past, it's been a lagging indicator of the underlying problems. This time around, this is the problem. And by the way, this problem is being created not by some long-term restructuring of the U.S. economy, but the very short-term public health mandates. Again, it's a critical distinction. It means you cannot just look at the unemployment rate today and say it tells us exactly the same thing as what it told us, say, in June of 2009. It just doesn't. In fact, do this little thought experiment for a second. Imagine 2 or 3 weeks after the public health mandates went into place to control the spread of this virus, some genius had come up with a miracle cure for the COVID. Well, what would have happened then? Well, I think we all could have agreed after a couple of weeks, all those folks would have simply gone back to work almost immediately, almost entirely. In other words, there's nothing to say that these people being a temporary layoff is in itself a problem for the economy. Rather, while these people are not working and they're not earning income, while the businesses they work for are shut down, well, the lack of income is creating problems right now. And that's, again, kind of important because we don't know how much of a problem. That is what we have to figure out. If it's a large problem, then okay, it's understandable that we might see a Great Recession type scenario. We have the big hit, takes us a long time along the bottom before we have that slow, painful recovery back to normal growth trends. But if it's not a lot of damage at all, perhaps it's more like the 1990 recession, where it's a sharp down, but then we get going relatively quick. This would be a 3-quarter recession without too much long-run harm to the economy. Or equivalently, if it's very short run with very little damage to the economy, well, that could end up being a natural disaster type scenario. A natural disaster scenario is one where you take the short run hit, but not only do you quickly get back to normal, but what didn't happen during the shutdown, people not going to restaurants, people not going to Disneyland, well, that's all the stuff they did right away once the economy got up and running again. And that would cause the economy to actually overperform immediately after things start to open up. That N-shaped sort of trajectory is something we've seen, for example, in South Florida after Hurricane Andrew wiped out temporarily the Miami-Dade region, or even in Los Angeles here in Southern California after the Northridge quake. Very sharp, very short, with a big bounce in the back end that more or less negates anything. We just don't know. And that's the key. All the people leaping to the conclusion that this is going to be this incredibly negative business cycle are making assumptions that simply they don't have any reason to be making. With that in mind, how do we figure this out? Well, the way to think about this is the amount of damage that occurs right now that will in turn determine how rapid of a recovery once the mandates are lifted. It depends on 5 basic questions. How long would the shutdowns last? How deep are the shutdowns? How healthy was the economy before the shutdowns actually took place? What is the government doing in the meantime? And then last but not least, is there a chance that consumers or businesses will permanently change their behavior? Well, these 5 questions will determine the shape of this recovery. If these questions all turn out to be relatively mild, then this is a quick recovery, the V. If we look at these questions and it turns out to be substantially worse, well, then maybe there is a case to be made for the U. So let's go through these really quick and see what we think. First of all, how long? Well, here we have a decent path in front of us. And of course, that comes from information coming out of China. China more or less got control over this virus in about 3 months. Now, I realize there's a little bit of flare up here and there. They're not completely out of the woods. But for the most part, their economy seems to be picking up. And we can look at that as a good example of where we think the United States is going to end up when we get control of this. And again, taking a look at China, here's some high-frequency data that comes from Goldman Sachs. You can see on the left-hand side, this is industrial activity. On the right-hand side is consumer activity. In both of these cases, if you look closely, again, it's a 3 to 4 month exercise. So here in the United States, if you look at the number of new cases occurring on a day-to-day basis, clearly we're over the hump. Things are starting to come back down again. Maybe a little bit slower than China because we have different states doing different things at different times. But nevertheless, this seems to be about a 3-4 month sort of episode. This suggests that in June, the economy will be largely open. May, we're already starting to see some signs of things opening. The governor has released certain parts of the economy move ahead. That will continue over the next few weeks. And even though I appreciate that maybe some things won't come back, maybe we won't have big conferences or big music events in the second half of the year, for the most part, most of the economy should be up and running by Q3. That's good. That means it's not all that long. Number 2 is how deep. Now again, we don't have a lot of data. Anecdotally, I get it. It's kind of weird that kids aren't going to school and the 405 and the 5 are empty in the middle and in rush hour. The fact that you can't go to stores and in restaurants are only takeout. It's odd. But you know, you got to be careful because if you put all airlines, hotels, recreation, entertainment, and restaurants all in one bundle, guess what? It's still smaller than healthcare by itself. While these are visible parts of the economy, they aren't necessarily large parts of the economy. And indeed, if you take a look at Q1, now admittedly only a couple weeks where we're actually shut down, but if you saw there was only a small dip in retail sales, only a small dip in industrial production. It wasn't that big just yet. Now, when we did some simulations at Beacon Economics to try to get our head wrapped around this. And what we found, oops, sorry, I'm getting ahead of my slides here. What we found, of course, is that if you actually look at the front end and you start thinking about which sectors are pulling back and which ones aren't, overall, we're looking at about 8 to 10% of the economy being directly shut down by the supply chains. Now, that's a lot. That's a huge amount. And indeed, we think that the Q2 growth could come in somewhere between 15 and 25% in the negative. That would be the largest negative quarter ever seen in the history of the United States since we started counting things this way. That's a big downturn. But remember, yet again, first of all, those numbers aren't as big as they look because that's at a seasonally adjusted annualized basis. Us economists have a frustrating way of presenting this data. We always multiply by 4 as if it was a whole year. In terms of actual quarter to quarter, this actually represents somewhere between a 4 and 6% decline in overall economic activity. Again, still the largest we've ever seen. It's a big number, but the reason that's important is, remember, for all the businesses and workers who are not able to work, who are not able to operate, who are losing income, there are other folks who are still working, who are still earning income, and aren't able to spend it. The reason that's relevant, well, let's take a look at the March savings rate. This is the savings rate for March of this particular year, and look at that enormous... sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties here with this remote control. The balance between spending and income. Go back to that idea, that trade-off, if you will, between people who are not working versus people who aren't able to spend. Well, the savings rate reflects that. Because remember, you got declines in spending, declines in incomes. Savings rate went up to 13.1%. That's the second highest it has ever been. Now, I know that doesn't seem like a lot after all, 8% to 13%, 5 percentage points, but that's 5 percentage points of 75% of the economy. All by itself, that represents, in 1 month, an amount of money that's, roughly 5%, 4% of GDP. That's a giant amount of pent-up demand sitting there waiting to come out. What it says is for every household falling behind, there's another household that is actually getting farther ahead. And that's really good news for the economy. It means, yet again, on net, we should have enough pent-up demand to get those people back to work relatively quickly. Now, third question, how healthy of an economy? Well, this is something I've been talking about for a while. It goes back to the core of the argument made here today, which is the economy has been very healthy. We have not been on the verge of a recession. In fact, in many fundamental ways, the U.S. economy is the healthiest it's been in 30 years. I appreciate that growth isn't all that exciting, but growth isn't necessarily the be-all and end-all. A lot of it has to do with the stability of things. And again, 2019, for all that pessimism, was a perfectly reasonable year, about a 2.35% growth rate. Labor markets, you've seen a slowing job growth. That's true over the last couple of years. But then again, the unemployment rate's been at 3.5%. Indeed, the job openings rate for the last 2.5 years, up until the pandemic, has been higher than the unemployment rate. There have actually been more job openings than people looking for work in the U.S. economy. Labor shortages was the biggest problem our nation and our state, and indeed Orange County, faced prior to this pandemic. Now again, that's good news for any number of reasons. It means fundamentally we have a very solid economy, and it means that even if some of these people aren't able to go back to their jobs after their temporary layoff, well, there's going to be plenty of opportunities in a labor-constrained nation for them. The household savings rate. Back in 2007, it was near an all-time, well, it was at an all-time record low of about 2%. Prior to the surge we saw in March, savings rates had grown organically up to about 8%. Because of those tight labor markets, wages have been rising. I know you've heard over and over how incomes aren't rising. That's based on data from the BLS that any economist who understands that data understands is flawed. The Atlanta Fed guys have something called the wage tracker. Once you inflation adjust it, turns out over the last 5 or 6 years, average real wage gains have been 4%, median about 2%. These are good numbers. This has been a very healthy labor market, and even this doesn't capture it because it doesn't include the amazing advances in communication and entertainment that we've been privy to as a result of the ongoing information technology revolution. And in terms of who's carrying debt, take a look on the right-hand side here. This is financial obligations ratio. That's a percent of household income spent on financial obligations, be it rent, mortgage payments, everything else. As you can see, prior to the Great Recession, record high level. Right now, record low level. In fact, people aren't carrying a lot of debt burdens, which again improves the resiliency through this period of disruption. On the left-hand side, breaks down a little bit about who is actually not bad off from a debt perspective. A lot of folks are immediately going to say, well, that's fine for the top 10 or 20%, but everybody else is buried in debt. Again, that's not true. You can see on the left-hand side, this is data from the Survey of Consumer Finances, and it shows for all income levels, not only is the ratio of debt payments today lower than it was in 2007, it's lower than it was in 1998. This is a financially stable American public. And by the way, something I want to take on very quickly. I am sure you have heard multiple times in the paper that the majority of Americans can't scrape together $400 for an emergency. I can't even begin to tell you how many economists have debunked that particular myth. Yet, somehow or other, it has become conventional wisdom in the news, and they continue to publish it, even though it comes from a completely, utterly, totally discredited survey done by the Federal Reserve a couple years ago. Again, it's not true. People do have money. They have opportunities to go ahead and stay above water. And of course, this doesn't even get to the social support net systems we have in place to help them. We'll come back to that in just a couple minutes. How about overall debt? We've been hearing from all the barons of titans of finance, hedge fund managers, that we're going to see financial turmoil in the way we saw prior to during the Great Recession. And again, based on what? Look, the financial turmoil that occurred during the Great Recession didn't occur because of the recession. It occurred because of the $15 trillion in subprime borrowing that had preceded it. That was the pain, not the downturn. This time around, in fact, financial markets were in great shape, in part because of some of the regulations that were put in at the back end of the Great Recession to prevent the kind of excess that was going on that drove that horrendous business cycle in the U.S. economy. Take, for example, debt as a share of GDP. Private sector debt to GDP has actually been falling for the last decade after that record high level. And you know, if you want to think if there's problems in the credit markets, you're going to see it long before the recession begins. If you look at commercial bank delinquencies, the problems in those debt markets began in 2006 and 2007 and became very intense during the Great Recession. Prior to the hit of the pandemic, in fact, delinquencies were near record low levels in every category of debt. Again, not a fragile economy. Real estate, I heard from Moody's that if the shutdowns go till June or July, 15% of homeowners could get foreclosed on. Again, that's more than the Great Recession. That doesn't make any sense. Look, housing markets today are completely different than the housing markets prior to the Great Recession. Back then, we had tons of bad debt. Prices have been going through the roof. There have been extraordinary amount of borrowing, particularly subprime borrowing. This time around, none of those conditions are in place. Because of Dodd-Frank, over the last decade, the credit markets for mortgages have been quite tight. Indeed, the median credit score for a mortgage borrower has been running consistently above 750. And of course, the slow pace of borrowing combined with steady, good growth in home prices means the equity share of residential real estate today is at an all-time high level. This is a healthy housing market. Remember, unlike prior to the Great Recession, where overall number of units for sale for rent in the U.S. was at a record high level as a share of the housing stock, right now it's at a record low level. Owner costs, well, yet again, over the last decade, incomes have been rising. And if you look at the share of owners who are burdened or mortgage burdened or renters who are rent burdened, turns out the share who are mortgage and rent burdened have been falling for the last decade. This is an expensive housing market. It's the cheapest it's been in 10 years. That's not a housing market that's going to have a 15% foreclosure rate. Doesn't make any sense. As for manufacturing, well, the supply chain effects are starting to kick in. We know the auto sector has already shuttered a bunch of plants. But then again, manufacturing kind of has ebbs and flows. This is the second round of manufacturing problems we've seen in the third round, excuse me. We had a first round back in 15-16 with a commodity bust. And indeed, we saw a slowdown again through 2019. Some of this driven by the trade war, but a lot more of it, by the way, driven by a problem in oil. The oil problem we've had, by the way, has been an oil glut that's really had a big impact on our oil markets and oil exploration here inside the United States. And of course, by the way, that glut just got a lot worse. For those of you who caught the news, of course, A couple weeks ago, oil prices actually hit a magical negative $40. Now, of course, that negative $40 was due to the fact there was simply so much oil, no one had anywhere to put it. And that was a big problem. That was basically paying people just to store that oil until normal demand for oil comes back. But this is at the back end of years of decline in the oil industry because of this global glut. Indeed, mining exploration for shafts and wells was near a record low level when this thing hit. It's hard to kill a dead man. Again, I don't see this being a big cyclical aspect for things. What else should we think about? Let's go through our questions. How long? 4 months. How deep? About 10% of the economy. How healthy was the economy? Very. What is the government doing? Yet again, now versus the Great Recession, completely different. The Great Recession, for the first 6 months of the recession, people debated whether or not we had a recession. By the third quarter of 2008, it was finally apparent that things had gotten really, really ugly, and we started to see the first signs of some sort of stimulative effort from the Federal Reserve and the federal government. But it's worth noting, after Barack Obama won the election, there was a lot of contentiousness. And if you remember, Mitch McConnell stated out loud that his biggest goal after the election was not to fix the economy and help it through the Great Recession, but rather to make sure Barack Obama was a one-term president. With that kind of lack of focus, not a surprise that what they did put forward in terms of fiscal package was too little and too late and didn't do a whole lot. Boy, what a difference a few years makes. This time around, it's the exact opposite. We're far enough ahead of the recession, of the election, and there's no debate about whether or not the economy is suffering right now. And as a result of that, Congress and the president have opened up the spigots like we have never seen. They're already put into place $2.7 trillion of stimulus. $2.7 trillion. Remember, in any one quarter, there's about $5.5 trillion of economic transaction activity in the U.S. economy. They just lobbed a $2.7 trillion stimulus package at a $5.5 trillion economy. That is unbelievable. It's enormous. In fact, in a lot of ways, you could almost argue it's too much. Look, some of this stuff is really good. Businesses that need a loan, that are suffering through this, the PPP program is great as long as they can get the loan. And I'm really glad they expanded unemployment insurance, and the amount of benefits people can get are better than it was before. In fact, it's so good that we're already hearing anecdotes of how some people don't want to go back to work. They prefer to be home working on their side gig while they're getting an unemployment insurance check. That's an issue all in its own right. But then, of course, there's lots of crazy stuff. For example, sending the vast majority of Americans a $1,200 check, whether or not you've been harmed by the shutdowns. Now you're getting into basic election year politics, not true economic policy. But however you want to line it up, the reality is this. They are putting forward a tremendous amount of money. And while a lot of that money will probably just go secondarily right into the financial markets, it will nevertheless help those folks get from here to there to help this economy bounce back when these things go to an end. And it's not just the federal government. In the beginning of this, we had a massive problem in the debt markets. You saw bond markets were all over the map, and there was some problems in short-term lending. Well, the Federal Reserve jumped on that in days, and they have absolutely steadied the markets. Things are happening just fine now. And the IRS says you don't have to pay your taxes. Local governments are preventing evictions. Large public mortgage holders are just allowing you to not pay your mortgage for a couple of months. Even large landlords are getting into it. If you didn't see it, a few weeks ago, the Irvine Company, one of the largest landowners here in Orange County, told all their retail tenants, you don't have to pay your rent over the next couple of months as long as you make good over the next year. Again, we're all working together to make sure the burden on those businesses and people shut down isn't going to be that great when we actually lift these public health mandates. None of this suggests a long, painful downturn. It just doesn't. Now, the last thing is consumer behavior. Because again, you've heard all about it. This is a new normal. People are going to be afraid. They're going to be afraid to go to the mall. They're going to be afraid to go to the ballpark. They're going to be afraid to go to a restaurant. People are too scared. Well, to be clear, I'm a little bit of a student in history. Every forecaster should be. And I can tell you, there is no new normal here. You ever hear of polio? How about smallpox? The plague? Diphtheria, yellow fever, typhus, tetanus. I can go on and on and on and on. Look, pandemics, epidemics, have been with humanity forever, since the dawn of time. Yes, we've gotten a little lazy over the course of the last couple decades because public health officials have more or less really limited the impact these things have on our lives. But it still has happened. And looking into the past, we don't see any evidence that people simply refuse to come out of the cave when the pandemic has passed. We don't. Time after time, when the pandemic is gone and the danger is reduced, people go out and they live their lives again. And I expect that, I like to think at least, that we're as tough as past generations, that we're not going to let this thing influence us more than, candidly, the fairly worse circumstances they found themselves in back before we had all the magical equipment and healthcare techniques we have today, which really truly limits this far more so than any past pandemic. Again, I don't buy that either. So again, you go through the 5 questions, not that long, not that deep, healthy economy, tremendous amount of government action, no reason to assume major changes in consumer behavior. Not one of those things suggests a protracted downturn in the U.S. economy. Quite the opposite, it suggests a very sharp V, where yes, we have a record quarter down in Q2, and almost assuredly a record quarter up in Q3. It isn't harmless, I'm not saying that for a second. Clearly this is a recession, but it's going to be a very, very sharp but very short recession as far as recessions go. This is not a great recession type scenario. Back then, millions of people lost their jobs permanently. This time, far more millions of people have lost their jobs, but lost them temporarily. They think so, their business thinks so. Back then, a lot of people didn't have unemployment insurance. Today, vastly more people do, and the amount of benefits are greater than ever before. Back then, not much in the way of public health. Today, an overwhelming amount of help. It's not the same thing, and we should not expect in any way, shape, or form the same results. So why are the stock markets going crazy? Well, that's the question I've been asking myself for 10 years now. Look, this is the 7th major sell-off in the stock market, including what happened in January of last year when it was down 20%. And oh, by the way, by January of this year, not only had it completely erased that, but we ended up with the 3rd highest PE ratio ever seen in American stock markets. It was a bubble. And of course, that bubble has simply collapsed. The problems in our financial markets are not the current economic cycle that we find ourselves in the midst of. It's the problem with the market itself. Something is severely broken. The financial markets in the U.S. are supposed to be our shock absorber. They're supposed to help us get through the tough times. They're not. Right now, they're shock expanders. The financial markets have behaved so chaotically over the past 2 months that they've threatened to create a much larger crisis where one didn't need to exist, but for, of course, the phenomenal interventions on the part of the Federal Reserve. Folks, this isn't how financial markets are supposed to work. Everybody needs to call our regulator and make sure this thing comes to an end. Now, I apologize. I'm getting some weird movement in my slides again for reasons unclear to me. But again, let me get back. There you go. Again, phenomenal amount of turmoil in the markets today, and candidly, this kind of turmoil it needs to be dealt with so it doesn't create crises where they don't need to exist at all. Now, how about here in California? Do we stand out as being any different? How about here in Orange County? Well, the answer is no. In fact, things have been great in California. Yes, we've been dealing with a big slowdown in job growth. A couple of years ago, we were over 3%. Recently, we slowed down below the national average. But keep in mind, yet again, this is a labor scarcity conversation. Here in Orange County, prior to the pandemic, the unemployment rate was 2.5%. That's not a full labor market. That's beyond a full labor market. And candidly, it's hard to grow your business when there's no one to hire. Labor shortage has been a key problem. Now, it isn't economic problems. California's share of national personal income never been higher. Economic output in the state growing faster than the nation overall. It's a labor force conversation. As good as our economy has been, as strong as it's been, people are not moving here. And because they're not moving here, labor force growth over the last decade has averaged a little over 0.5%. It's hard. You can't have 3% job growth when your labor force is only growing at 0.5 to 2/3% per year. You just can't. That's a basic physical reality. Now, the reason, by the way, we can't grow our labor force is because we're not growing our housing stock. a housing problem. And that housing problem hasn't gone anywhere. A housing supply problem. Whether you're looking at housing units per capita, sure overcrowded housing, housing vacancy, everything says that California's biggest problem is not expensive housing, but a simple lack of housing. It's a supply crisis, short and simple. And sadly, while we were working very, very hard to try and fix the supply crisis, this virus has really taken our eye off the ball. And I worry about what we're going to do about this. If you're not thinking about housing, you're not thinking about the long-run crisis of supply we're facing here in California, well, bad things will happen and we're going to lose track, and it's going to take us a while to get back on. Here in Orange County, again, prior to this, things, again, had slowed down a lot. Job growth over the last year prior to pandemic was only 1%. Now we got the March number. We don't have April yet for Orange County. And the March number, yeah, we saw some declines in overall jobs. Not much of a surprise. The unemployment rate here in Orange County popped up to about 4%. Again, this is March. When we get the April numbers, expect that number to be much worse. And that, of course, has a lot to do with the big hospitality industry here in Orange County. Particularly up here, if you think about in the north part of the county, you're wrapped around Anaheim and Santa Ana. Disneyland, of course, is shut down. Knott's Berry Farm is shut down. And the coasts are shut down. And these are tremendous drivers of people coming here to Orange County. And all this is going to get hit. These numbers are going to be ugly when they come out. But there's some upsides. Well, we appreciate the sectoral problems the county faces. At the same time, it's also worth noting that the population here actually is phenomenally based around more skilled folks who not only are far less likely to receive even a temporary layoff, but are going to have a lot more money in the bank to help them through these few weeks. Again, this is one of the wealthiest economies in the state, and that will help it. So Orange County, again, is a bit of a mix. You got the tourism hit, which is going to be much worse than most places, but then you have a demographic base, which makes you far more I won't say immune, but certainly far more protected than, say, a place like out in the Central Valley or even the Inland Empire. So a bit of a mix right now. We're going to have to wait and see how this shakes out. But otherwise, prior to this, things were good. Taxable sales growth was starting to pick up. You look at non-residential vacancies, good steady number there across the board here in Orange County. You see vacancy rates were decent levels overall. Rents have continued to rise at a decent basis. Again, good steady signs there. Non-residential real estate, we saw investment had a very good year in 2019. Not quite as good as 2018, but still pretty good. And up, of course, until the pandemic hit, even 2020 was looking pretty good, as the case may be. The housing market here has been very solid. Home prices, after last year's temporary slowdown, have started to pick up again. And overall in Orange County, you're looking at about a 3.3% increase by the end of last year. Heating up, certainly was going to be a very good year this year. And for those of you who are wondering, yeah, we don't expect price growth to slow down, because real estate is a long-run market, not a short-run market. It doesn't respond to sharp downturns. It just doesn't. But it was nice and healthy in the first place. And again, as far as affordability goes, just like at the national level, if you look at median rent as a percent of household income or the share of rent-burdened households, believe it or not, in Orange County, that has been steady or falling. This is not an economy that has a lot of people on the edge of eviction. It actually is relatively stable compared to the last bunch of years. The one big issue, no residential construction. And again, this has been the biggest issue. A lack of labor force growth here in the county that has simply prevented businesses from having the available workforce to allow them to get back to work. Now, how many permits do you need? Candidly, if you wanted 2.5% job growth in Orange County, you need 33,000 permits per year. Orange County's been building about a fourth of that. It's a huge issue. It's an issue, of course, that we appreciate, the BIA appreciates. We understand someone has to do about it, and I don't want you to walk away from this particular issue just because of this short-run situation. Now, Orange County has gotten away with it all these years, largely because they've relied on the Inland Empire as the unending source of labor supply. But unfortunately, Inland Empire is not building either. And again, the reason that you saw things so constrained prior to the pandemic is largely because the Inland Empire and Orange County and LA, none of us are building enough housing, and the constraints are really starting to show in the local economy. So, let's go ahead and wrap things up. A few basic points. First thing, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. The cure is not worse than the disease. The efforts to flatten the curve, to turn this into a shorter, less intense cycle, are working. Let's keep working on it. We can handle the few weeks staying at home to make sure we get control of this thing and get control of it for good. Simple as that. Harder we work right now, we don't need the vaccine. We can go ahead and get on the other back end of this thing, but we have to work hard to get it under control right now. Second thing, we have a government that is lining up to borrow $3 trillion this year. It'll probably end up being more. I've heard estimates as high as $3.5 trillion, and that is even without an additional stimulus package. Could it be $4 trillion this year? Now remember, of that $3 trillion, $1 trillion was already in the books. The rest of it is, of course, because of the stimulus package. As a percent of GDP, this is greater than what we were borrowing during World War II. Back then, fighting a global war against fascism and tyranny. This time, we're fighting a national war against a bug. Back then, hundreds of thousands of Americans dying in combat. Now, about the same number of folks. But of course, much of this has to do with the disease. This is not the same sort of circumstance. And remember, they're throwing money at everything, even if it doesn't actually help. We have a long-run problem in the United States with entitlements, with Social Security, Medicare. Boomers are retiring. Economists have been warning for years and years that the federal budget is simply unsustainable. Not unlike epidemiologists, we're saying it's when, not if, the next big global pandemic hits. Don't ignore us, because right now, doing what we're doing, we're stepping on the accelerator and we're hurtling towards that fiscal crisis on a faster and faster basis. Prior to this, the federal government owed $50,000 on behalf of every man, woman, and child in the United States. Before this, they were going to borrow $3,000. After this, they're going to end up borrowing over $10,000 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. That's an obscene amount of money, and we all need to understand this isn't free. All the money we're gobbling up happily from the federal government is money our children are going to have to pay back. So, wrapping it up, our outlook for the economy, yes, it's a recession, but it's very sharp and very short. Negative 20% Q2, plus 20% Q3, back on track by the end of the year. Is that actually a recession? Hard to say. It'll probably be labeled as such, but again, it's not a recession in the way the Great Recession was. One that had within it a massive change in the structure of the economy. Yes, there'll be some moderate upticks in debt distress, the stock market, who knows. Little impact on real estate, because real estate's a long-run investment, and this is not a long-run phenomenon. And of course, as for the fundamentals of Orange County, you have some plus, because again, incredibly sturdy population base. The negatives, a big tourism base. On net, I don't think Orange County is either worse or better than the nation overall, but again, the fundamentals to get through this are there. Now, there are wild cards. Again, humility has to be something. There could be a second round of outbreaks, one in which the virus has mutated and our basic level of immunity that we have right now is not with us. Got to pay attention to that. Low probability. Yes, global situations. Of course, retail and restaurants, look, those sectors aren't going to come back fully, not because of the virus, but because they were stressed already. Retail because of competition from the internet, and of course, restaurants because there were too many. So there's going to be some dislocation there, no doubt about it. But it's simply fast-forwarding problems that were going to occur. Financial markets, again, worry me. They're all over the map. They're behaving excessively chaotic. As for the tourism industry, I think there's a lot of questions about when that can reopen. That's important, particularly for Anaheim and Santa Ana, which are so reliant on those parks. And of course, the thing that I'm worried about from a long-run standpoint are federal and local budgets. The federal budget, because they're borrowing like a drunken sailor, and of course, the local governments, because they're getting hit. We know their pension obligations are there and growing rapidly. And by the way, all their investment portfolios just got blown up. Going to be a lot of shakeout at the local level. We have a lot of issues to deal with local government and already, and this is only going to make that situation more intense. But still, on net, we're pretty positive. Short, sharp growth in the second half of the year. And for the most part, we don't see any long-run dislocation in the U.S. economy. For the most part, we expect that this is mainly a source of stories. What did you do during the great virus shutdown? So, with that in mind, my request of you is very simple. Turn off the weapons of mass distraction. Don't let the screaming talking heads get into your brain. They're there trying to get your attention. Pay attention to me. They're there for strategic positioning, so they get their pile of money from the federal government. They're not there telling you the true economic reality of the situation. If you sit back and you think about those 5 basic questions, it's not that bad. We should work together, make sure we work hard to get control of this virus, and understand that once those things happen, there's no reason in the world that we shouldn't have a bright, happy future, a future really that's simply on the other side of this particular year. Thank you very much, everybody. With that, I know we have another word for our sponsors coming up, and then we're going to have time for Steve and I to answer a few questions. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kristen Kamoya, Director of Government Affairs for Cox Communications. As we move forward during these unprecedented times, Cox Communications is continuing to work hard to ensure that you stay connected to the things that matter most. During the COVID-19 crisis, we have been committed to keeping you, your family, and employees safe while continuing to provide the exceptional service you know and love. Cox Communications is proud to be a continued partner of the South Orange County Economic Coalition and today's program, the 2020 Economic Report. We thank you for your support and for watching today's program. Remember, stay home, stay safe, stay connected.
Business owners, we know you've had to adapt, working where you need to, how you need to, and making it work, no matter how much work has changed. Back to business might not feel like back to normal. But as you rethink your business, we'll be here to keep you connected.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, I'm Steve Lamont, Chair of the Economic Coalition, and we're here talking with Dr. Thornburg of Beacon Economics. Thank you, Doctor. Really interesting information that you've just shared, and we appreciate your perspective on where we're headed. We do have some questions from our viewers, so if you'd like to jump in right now, please comment in the thread. And as a reminder, again, comment below, and we'll try to get all these questions answered as quickly as possible. So with that, we are live. We do have questions coming in. So I'm going to start off with Audrey. What industries do you think will become obsolete in virtue of the pandemic? And where do you see opportunities lie ahead, especially here in Orange County?
Well, I hope what comes obsolete are these miserablest forecasters who are out there trying to scare the hell out of everybody by telling them these stories about decay and decline. Probably won't happen, though. Look, I don't see any major restructuring of the economy. I don't think anybody's going to become obsolete per se. Now, have we learned something? We've learned a lot, right? First of all, we learned, like the epidemiologists have been telling us for a long time, these things can occur. And we all have to appreciate we have to have systems in place. You know, I keep reminding people one of the reasons this thing was so bad is not just the virus. It's the fact that when people were already dying of the virus here in the United States, the federal government was telling us everything was fine and they had it under control. Sure. So you only get one Pearl Harbor. It got out of control the first time, but we're smarter, wiser. We wash our hands. We stay away from each other, and that means it's going to be a lot tougher for this thing to get out of hand. So that's one thing we've learned. What else have we learned? We've learned that working from home isn't nearly as much fun as we thought.
Sure. I would have to agree. I'm working on my garage right now. So.
Exactly. And that's certainly something that's probably important. I've heard people say, oh, no one's ever want to go back to the office. I think most people want to go back to the office right now. But at the same time, I think employers have also learned that people can work from home at some reasonable level of productivity. And maybe people will be more willing to let folks, particularly those who have those long commutes, work from home once or twice a week, and that would be a good thing as well.
So you bring up a good point. Yeah. Commercial markets, working at home. Let's see. It sounds like we have a lot of stuff that's helping us get through this.
Absolutely.
So it's going to come down to when are we going to reopen?
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
So I guess the question would be, with these benchmarks that have now been recently set that seem to be a little bit difficult to actually hit.
You think?
Especially here in Orange County. I think if I'm not mistaken, it's no deaths within 2 weeks. You actually have to lower your cases per 10,000. So I guess the question will be, how much longer can we go through this? What if stay-at-home orders continue through the summer? And then what if this comes back in the winter?
Well, there's a couple things here. I appreciate that the governor put out some rules, and I also appreciate he's getting a phenomenal amount of pushback because you're not the only person saying, hey, come on, really?
Sure.
And this is overdone. And I think my guess is they will modify those rules and become a little less severe as time goes on, as long as things continue to get better. I don't have a pure crystal ball on this, but again, I would point out to people that things are already loosening up. Maybe not everything. Maybe not your favorite restaurants and open, but we know some kinds of retail open. Healthcare. And by the way, what's interesting is people don't appreciate this. Healthcare has been a phenomenally large part of the slowdown in the economy. And we kind of missed this one. We didn't expect the first quarter to be as bad. And when I dug into the numbers, I realized that I anticipated an increase in healthcare spending, and we've seen the exact opposite. Because the number of people showing up at the emergency room for treatment for the virus has been nowhere near what they were anticipating. And at the same time, all the elective procedures that were put on hold, well, I mean, that's a phenomenal moneymakers. Now, yet again, this contributes to the V, and I'll tell you why in two ways. First of all, healthcare is not a cyclical industry. There wasn't 1 quarter of downturn in healthcare spending during the Great Recession in the U.S. because it's funded through insurance, it's funded through the government. It doesn't go away. Now, everybody who didn't have their teeth cleaned, that cavity filled, all the things that needed to be done in the last few weeks, you're going to get it done this year.
Correct.
And as a result of that, expect a pretty good surge in healthcare, particularly now the governor again is releasing some of this. That'll help make the second quarter look a little better. There's another thing here too, though, and I think it's important. And I don't want to. I realize I'm giving long answers here, but I'm an economist. All my answers are long.
Exactly.
The other thing is this, and I think people have to appreciate the idea of mitigation. The other thing that's helpful is that even for businesses who are going to be under a certain degree of restrictions, are still figuring out ways around it, right? We've all our businesses who are not operating, we're doing everything over Zoom and we're interacting with their folks on that particular basis. Restaurants, a lot of restaurants have put together very successful takeout programs.
Yep.
Now they're not making as much money as they were before because you're not getting the booze, and man, that's where all your margins are, right? But they are keeping busy. And I think what you're finding is that people are getting clever about figuring out ways of doing business, of making money, even in the midst of the pandemic, and that's going to help some as well. So, yeah, it's going to pan out over the next couple months in various fits and starts. I think what we can say for sure is we're absolutely at the bottom right now.
Sure.
And it's only up from here. The question is how much up? Is it this much up or is it that much up?
So kind of to that point, you mentioned tourism. Orange County obviously focuses heavily on tourism.
Tourism, yeah.
Where do you see the tourism market going once these restrictions are lifted? And then I'm going to throw something else at you. But what happens to the cities who rely on the tourism? You kind of mentioned in your presentation, I know we'll kind of reiterate some of the stuff here, but where does the tourism industry go here for Orange County? And then again, the cities that rely on that income.
Sure, and to be clear, you keep hearing, oh, it's a new normal, it's a new normal. Honestly, I don't know. There's a great article in the newspaper over the weekend about Lake Havasu, which over in Arizona, it's a mob scene. Every Californian is packed out there. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, you had 1 week of the beaches here being open, and everybody was here. People want to get out. Yeah. If you open up, people are going to come back. Now, it's not going to be back, I think, to the same huge proportion. Grandparents are going to be nervous. They're going to hold back. The international segment is going to be a little slower.
Sure.
I think that will lag. That's what I said near the end. And I think that tourism aspect will lag everything else here. But nevertheless, we see it getting back to normal by the beginning of next year, more or less. And that's going to help things really, again, get back to normal relatively quickly. For me, the big issue you brought up are these budgets, these cities that rely on this stuff. Cities across California have already been just hammered over the last few years, largely by the rising pension obligations. by the fact that they're constrained and how they can raise money in ways that simply aren't proportionate to the increasing cost of running a local government in the state of California. And this is hammering them when they really don't have the space to be hammered. It's going to be a lot of soul searching, and I think the state's going to have to figure out how to help these folks through it. It's just as simple as that. But in the end, we need to figure out how to make our local governments a little bit more resilient to business cycles.
So you mentioned housing, and we're live here, so I want to remind everybody to please go online, try to put some comments in the thread. And so here's a question, Jim Leach, and this is actually something I saw recently, is the amount of fake news that's out there.
Yeah, no kidding.
And scaring everybody, as you mentioned earlier. So what source or sources do you recommend to help the layman understand these circumstances in the economy right now?
Well, there's these super bright guys at this company called Beacon Economics.
That's
They're based out of LA now. Well, look, obviously you can sign up for our materials, and we try to get people the straight story, as the case may be. It's out there. Look, there are people trying to tell you the right stuff.
Sure.
It's not just us. The problem is we always end up with the ninth paragraph.
Yeah.
What you have to do is you got to change your news consumption habits a little bit. People's problem is everybody's, and I get it, I do the same thing. You're busy, I'm busy, we're all constantly bombarded with things competing for our attention on a minute by minute by minute basis. And as a result of that, we become a headline society. We only read the headlines, the first paragraph, and we move on. You can't do that. You got to dig into the article. You got to see the different opinions. You got to see who's saying what, and think about why they're saying it. And this isn't just the pandemic.
Sure.
This is elections. This is the economy. This is everything. Objectively speaking, people in the United States are enjoying a quality of life that not only is better than 50 years ago, it's better than 20 years ago by a good margin. We live phenomenally better lives than the vast majority of the population of the world. And yet you pick up the paper and you see nothing but nonstop litany of people complaining about how terrible everything is. I don't know why. Why have we lost such connection with anything resembling objective reality? Why are we in this weird place? I don't have an answer. It certainly isn't just this. It's been an ongoing problem, and I would just ask everybody to be a little smarter about this.
Exactly. Good point. So another question here, we were talking about actually earlier, and something that you might be hearing a lot of different people say is, I'm making more money on unemployment than I was when I was working.
Yeah.
And so we have a question here, and it's from, let's see, it looks like Gabriel.
Yeah.
So how do companies get employees back who
Well,
are making more money?
Well, they're not technically making more money,
Sure.
but
Explain,
they're not paying
please.
taxes, and you
Exactly.
probably have a side gig, and you get to play all day, and you know, frequent the local takeout wine and weed shop and enjoy yourself, right? It sounds great. Functionally speaking, yeah, you probably do have a better quality of life, as the case may be. The thing to remember on this is, yes, it will encourage some people to maybe lag behind.
Sure.
But I think it's pretty clear that employers just have to say, look, I'm turning on. You're either here or you're not.
Exactly.
And I think that'll get people to
Good point.
yeah. And if someone really says, I don't want to come back to work, all right, take care.
Yeah.
I think people are going to be a little bit more logical than that when push comes to shove.
Good. Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So another item you mentioned was the savings rate. Currently
Yeah.
for individuals. And I know, again, you kind of talked about this a little bit, but articles I have been seeing personally is we haven't had this type of savings rate since the 80s.
We haven't
to
seen
an extent.
No, this is
the most
13% savings rate. I'm sorry, the 8% savings rate we had in February was, outside of a couple of weird periods after the tax changes, was the highest since 1992,
Sure.
right? And we had grown there organically. From February to March, the savings rate went from 8% to 13.1%.
Okay.
Now again, 5 percentage points doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think about that 5% of 75% of the economy, because it includes all the people who are self-employed, all the people who work, so on and so forth, 75% of the economy, that's a huge number. I mean, you're talking about 4% of GDP all by itself. That is a phenomenal amount of dry powder, just sitting there, waiting to be spent. And I appreciate some households are falling behind, some businesses are struggling, but They're struggling because these people can't spend this money. These people have a mass of unspent money that's going to come pouring out, and that's going to help these people.
So you have a different take on it, though, than from what articles I've been seeing recently. You see that as a positive. Of
course.
Because you see it as the second we get back to, you know, when these regulations are lifted, people are pumping that right into the economy.
I think what you're saying is this being caused by the mandates directly, or is it being caused by people being afraid of the budgets? Sure. You know what? I don't think it's all that big of a difference. So the funny is California is keeping restrictions, but for anybody not paying attention, have you noticed that every single day that's gone by, there's a few more cars on the road, a few more. I was in the 405 the other day and I hit a traffic jam. I'm like, what's this? Oh yeah, I remember traffic. That was the thing we had 6 weeks ago. So we are seeing people here going out and doing things anyway, and the governor has to pay attention to the fact that people are going to make certain decisions. Better to work with them to try and constrain them. At the same time, you go to a place like Georgia, which has lifted the restrictions, and guess what? People are not going out at anywhere near the level they were pre-virus. In a lot of ways, it's the same thing, whether it's regulated or unregulated. As we get through this, people get comfortable with the circumstances, as they're comfortable that the procedures we have in place will more or less protect them, or maybe that they don't need to be protected at all, this is going to get up and running. Whether that's 2 weeks from now, 4 weeks from now, 6 weeks from now, it still says Q3 we should be largely back to normal, which is when most of the rebound is going to occur.
Okay, well, good point. Well, thank you. So one thing I don't think that was mentioned in the presentation, if I missed it, I apologize, but schools obviously have been closed. And so,
well, I mean, not technically. I mean, they're open. The teachers are getting paid.
They're just at home. The students are at home.
Students at home. Yeah.
So, could schools reopen, you know, quote unquote, if you will, positively? And this is from Jennifer, or negatively? What will it do to the economy? How do you see this process playing out?
Look, because education is mostly public funded and they're still paying the teachers, it's as simple as that. It's not a big part of the cycle. It is obviously a big part of our lives. I mean, one of the bigger problems we have here is that a lot of parents can't work or are limited in how much work they can do, in part because they got to take care of the kids.
Yep.
If you reopen the economy but don't put kids back into school, we're going to actually run into labor problems because not a lot of these people are going to be able to go back to work because they have to stay home and take care of their kids. So there's going to have to be some coordination between these two parts of the conversation to make this work right, and we'll see what they end up doing on that particular front. It's worth noting that for the most part, I understand the scare stories are out there. They always want to take 1 or 2 cases of some kid who actually did get sick and turn it into a huge thing. But for the most part, as far as I can tell, you can give a kid a COVID-19 milkshake, he'll be fine. I'm not going to battle him at all, okay? The problem is they're going to go to school, maybe be exposed to somebody else, and then bring it home to grandma.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where the issues lie, and they're going to have to figure out how to deal with that part of the conversation, as the case may be. But let me just add one thing here, too, because you know, again, there are lessons to be learned here, and since you brought that up, I'm going to run with it just for a second. The state has been spending a phenomenal amount of money on online education. It's seen as a way of getting more students access to higher education, but doing so in a way that doesn't cost the state a lot of money. Hey, we can ramp up online, and we don't have to worry about classrooms or having more professors and this kind of stuff. It's a cheap way of accelerating the amount of education going on. Well, I think what we're learning from kindergarten to college is that while maybe you and I are entertaining enough to people here that they're going to stick around and learn something,
Mostly, yeah.
That's not true, Mr. Ness. Now, from kindergarten to college students, I am hearing everybody, from teachers to the students, tell me, this sucks. It doesn't work. I'm not learning. I'm not teaching. The online course I think is really proven to be kind of a false promise. Okay. I think in some cases, in some ways, you might make it work under truly extraordinary circumstances. The power of the human interaction, the fact that you and I are sitting here talking, it's far more powerful than if we were doing it over a screen. It's as simple as that. And for education, it's so important.
Do you have that same theory for online colleges? which have been doing online for obviously
yeah,
quite some
well.
time.
No,
Okay.
I mean, no one has a lot of respect for those degrees. It's just not the same thing. It's that interaction between you and your professor and your classmates. That's where you learn.
Sure, exactly.
Remember, you're not learning facts in college. You're learning how to think. You're learning how to problem solve. And that's something that has to have a degree of interaction. It just does.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. So, from Fred, what impact will the election have on the recovery? Trump versus Biden.
Well, it already has, right?
Sure.
The presence of the election is why our government's going crazy throwing money at this. $2.7 trillion. And I was reading that the Democrats have another couple $1 trillion plan they want to put into action.
Yep.
Are you kidding me? $5 trillion in stimulus in a $5 trillion quarter?
Yeah.
I mean, come on. It's obnoxious. So the fact that the election is there is causing our federal government to act in a bizarrely fiscally unsustainable way. But then again, that's just adding on to the trends of the last few years where we've had numerous budgets. We had a $1 trillion deficit, 11th year of the expansion, one of the fundamentally most healthy economies we've seen in 30 years. And we were going to run a $1 trillion deficit? What are we thinking?
Well, kind of a good segue here. This is from Bill. Given the government stimulus, as you kind of were just discussing, when will we see a pickup in inflation?
It's a separate conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, the inflation is a money supply conversation. That's a Federal Reserve conversation. The government doesn't have the ability to print money directly to pay its bills, and so borrowing money doesn't create inflation. It's how you pay your bills back. You pay those bonds back. That's what can create inflation, but that's a 10-year.
So from Dwight, will there be layoffs after PPP forgiveness period is completed?
No, I mean, I wouldn't say I think so. Again, I'm going to go back to what I just said.
Yeah.
This is functionally short term.
Yeah.
If a company was successful before, it should be successful after. There's no reason to see any major shifts in the structure of the economy that creates this long-run, painful regrouping, regrowth, the way we saw during the Great Recession. So no, technically speaking, once the mandates go away, we should be more or less up and running.
Good. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to end with this last question, and I think we've had this conversation before, but I like to try to end on a positive note. What are the silver linings that we're going to walk away from due to this pandemic?
Okay, a couple things. First of all, I think we're lucky that this pandemic was as not bad as it is. Now, I know a lot of people are going, oh, you're talking about 100,000, almost 100,000 people dead in the United States. You're talking, yeah, I get that. But, what we're learning as we do more and more testing is a lot more people have been exposed to this than we realize.
Sure.
And every time you find more and more people who were asymptomatic and it came and went with nothing, we realize that death rate actually becomes lower and lower. The reality is, had this thing been as toxic as Ebola, as MERS, as SARS, this could have been a lot uglier. We have been ignoring these epidemiologists for years. They've been saying it's not if, it's when, and here it is. So I think we go away from this understanding that these problems do exist. We have to listen to public health folks. We have to be resistant to this kind of stuff, period. I think that's a silver lining. Another basic silver lining is we're learning we're on the same team. If you think about, for example, what's happening in terms of the relationship between landlords and tenants, we're on the same team. We need to figure this out together. People in the neighborhood, we're on the same team. We need to figure this out together. I think this has created a degree of community interrelationship that we haven't seen in a while, that maybe goes beyond the Republican-Democrat flag-waving camps. And I think that's important for us to grab hold of and try to push forward as well. Now, I know everybody's trying to turn this into a political debate. You got the Trump supporters who are saying, open our economy, and no. I think the vast majority of people in the middle understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, are comfortable with it happening as long as it's on a reasonable basis. And we have to allow our ability to work with each other to get beyond these crazed, insanely partisan political debates that our economy has become so tough.
Well, I appreciate it. Dr. Chris Thornburg, thank you so much. Any closing remarks? Anything else you want to say that you might not have been able to say so far?
Just don't let them get to you. I know you've heard the statement. You can't just turn the economy back on. None of these small businesses are going to reopen. Take a step back, think through the logic of what they're saying, and you start to realize, again, they're trying to make headlines. They're not trying to give you an honest analysis. Be a smart listener. That's a big takeaway here.
Okay, well, thank you. So in closing, I want to again thank our sponsors, our platinum sponsors, SDG&E and Cox Communications, thank you so much, and our gold sponsors, the Toll Roads, SoCal Gas Company. And thank you again to Dr. Chris Thornburg for joining us today. It was an amazing presentation and discussion, and we value your time here that you have taken with us. So if you'd like a copy of Dr. Thornburg's presentation, please visit our website, economiccoalition.com, and you can download it there. And most importantly, thank you to our viewers for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to tune in. I want to make a special note that our upcoming June membership meeting on Friday, June 12th, 11:30, where we will actually have a follow-up on today's segment by having some of the business leaders who are representing some of the industries Dr. Thornburg spoke to today. Also, if you're interested in becoming a member of the coalition, please visit our website at economiccoalition.com. Again, my name is Steve Lamont, Chair of the Economic Coalition, and we'll see you on June 12th. Thank you.